So yeah, of course, like, coming out of working on, with Samara Joy and being in a Grammy awarded recording, I was wondering, like, what was your mindset as you head into, creating your debut solo, and what were like the main things that you wanted to imprint in this recording and sort of like showcase as your first formal recording under your name, sorry.
Sure, yeah. So for my first recording, I really wanted to honor everybody who had invested in me, who had invested in my growth as a person and invested in my growth as a musician. And so those are people like my parents, a lot of my former teachers, people like Donald Brown, Keith Brown, who's a drum teacher I studied with in Tennessee, Rodney Whitaker, Michael Dees, Ulysses Owens, just a lot of people who kind of paved the way for me and took me under their wing and showed me a lot of things when I was first getting exposed to the scene, both in New York City, but also the scene kind of touring. Yeah. So in that first project, I wanted to pay tribute to all of them. And some of the people in particular that I decided to pay tribute to were the Memphis piano players. So Donald Brown being originally from, born in Mississippi, I believe, but raised in Memphis, Tennessee, and also kind of claims Memphis. A lot of his colleagues and mentors are people who also inspired me a great deal, kind of through my studies with him. So those ended up being some of my favorite piano players as well, just hearing his excitement talking about them. Yeah. People like Mulgrew Miller and James Williams, and Phineas Newborn, and Harold Mayburn, and Charles Thomas, and even the non-pianists like Booker Little and Charles Lloyd and George Coleman, just all the people that came out of Memphis, Lewis Smith. There's so many incredible jazz musicians who came through that city, and they kind of ended up becoming some of my huge inspirations. And I wanted to pay tribute to each of them by recording a song from each of the piano players that I tended to, I kind of was magnetized to, and also contributing some original compositions, which is something I started doing when I was in college, a lot more composing. So yeah, that was kind of most of the concept behind my debut record.
Excellent. And like to talk first about your compositions, I think like some of these, of course, have been developed over time, or you have been working on them for a couple of years. But tell us a little bit, sort of like how did they come to life? What were like the initial, perhaps, inspirations that you took away from and how did it evolve over time? And like if you have perhaps like a knowledge of around how much time it takes to actually, put that into recording or put that into an idea that you think is, worth recording and putting into the world. Just about those 4 songs that you have in the recording.
Yeah, sure. So for the originals, I started composing. I think the one that I started working on first was actually the title track, I Owe It All to You. Yeah. And I believe I wrote that my first year of graduate school at Michigan State University. So that was about 2017, maybe 2018, when I composed that piece. And it first came kind of through the inspiration of everything I had listened to throughout my entire life. So being heavily steeped in gospel music for years, funk music, R&B, soul music, the sounds of the Temptations and Earth, Wind and Fire, Sly and the Family Stone, Tribe Called Quest. There's a lot of influences where maybe you might not directly hear it on every single song, but there is somewhat of an influence of some of those things on a few of the compositions. And as far as composing them, I feel like each one takes a different amount of time, just depending on life. There was one piece, the song that I wrote for my wife. At the time we were dating, we had just started dating, Until I See You Again. And we met in New York, we met in Michigan, and I moved to New York City shortly after. And so Ulysses Owens, who had just hired me to play in his band, Generation Y Quintet, asked me to write a few songs for the group. And so that song kind of came pretty immediately, pretty quickly, because I was writing through the inspiration of this newfound love, this new relationship that I developed.
So there was, sorry that I interrupt, but of course there was an intentionality, like you will say on that one specifically, as you were exploring the process of creating it, right?
Right, oh yeah, that one was specifically intended to be a love song, and I wanted to reflect the feelings of longing, not knowing the next time I would see this person who I had just met and had these deep feelings for and towards. And I think I Owe It All to You was also something, it was a song that I guess I had already predetermined what I wanted it to at least feel like. Maybe not exactly what I wanted it to sound like, but I wanted it to feel like a jazz interpretation of a gospel song in a way, you know? So I wanted there to be elements of different sections in the piece where you could kind of directly connect that to a gospel piece or a hymn or something of that nature. But yeah, I mean, all of the pieces, some of them, you know, like the Things We Used to Say was written through the inspiration of Rodney Whitaker, really. Somebody who was one of the driving forces behind 90s jazz, you know, I mean, continued from there, like still has a very strong impact on the music to this day as both a performer and an educator, especially. And so I wanted to kind of write something that had a bit of that edge and soulfulness to it as well. So that's kind of what I was thinking on that one. But yeah, each piece, there was a lot of intentionality behind why I wrote it. It wasn't like, oh, this sounds good, let's play it and record it. There was a story behind each of those.
Like just, you already alluded that, of course, you had one of them, of course, like was your teacher during your development, but of course, being yourself from Charlotte, if I remember correctly, I'm just curious about learning a little bit more about how did you like got connected to that music specifically? Where did that sort of like connection just got started? And how that love for that music has carried on over the years from since your college educational days to now, you know, being imprint on the record.
Absolutely. So my first exposure to jazz was really through my school. I went to Northwest School of the Arts in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I was actually playing saxophone in the jazz ensemble. Now, prior to this, I was taking some drum lessons from some fantastic local teachers, Brian Burton, who I think might be in Colorado now, Greg Lisi, a guy, I forget his last name, Hunter, I can't remember his last name. I used to just call him Mr. Hunter, and my first teacher was Mr. Jack. I just called him Mr. in their first name. But anyways, each of them had exposed me a little bit to jazz music, but for me, it wasn't until I joined Jazz Arts Initiative, which is now called Jazz Arts Charlotte, that was led by, at the time, both Lonnie and O.C. Davis. And I think Lonnie is still kind of over it right now. And being around other musicians from my hometown was a huge inspiration to me. Seeing people from my hometown who were on the road with Prince, or on the road with Fantasia, or on the road with Anthony Hamilton or John P. Key. But they also had a lot of understanding of jazz music and swing music and understanding of the full history of that. That was a huge inspiration for me. And a lot of them took me under their wing. People like Harvey Cummings, people like Tim Scott Jr., Eleazar Schaefer, Lavelle Bradford, Charles Craig, John Alexander, who was a great tenor saxophonist and doubler who passed away a few years ago, Chad Lawson. There's so many names. Like Philip Wack, great tenor player. He's out in LA now. But a lot of them, those were a lot of musicians who kind of took me in and were calling me for gigs and teaching me things, teaching me tunes, and just showed me a lot. So there's a lot that I'm indebted to my hometown and to everybody there. And there's a lot of beautiful things that many of them are still doing to contribute to the scene in Charlotte. And there's a lot of beautiful music that's still coming out of there. And I'm meeting other musicians that are coming through the same program to this day. I think two of them are at Juilliard now. There's a great saxophonist, Veronica Leahy, and another tenor player. His name is escaping me right now, but fantastic tenor saxophonist. But anyways, I'm getting off track. But yeah, Charlotte made me. You know, that's my hometown, and there's so much that I learned from everybody there.
Interesting, because like always, like I think like from what I understand, seems like you were like formed into music, not necessarily coming from a musician's family, which I think is sometimes the case for a lot of people that you know, get into virtuosistic music, like, you know, at a very young age. It is always interesting for me to hear like how the influences that appear like in recordings like come from, like is it something that was passed along by parents, if it was passed along by peers, if it was learned at some point during your development. So like in this case, seems like it was, during your period of like actually once you started like getting a little bit more into the waves of the scene, both educationally and professionally as well, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. A lot of because at home and at home, my parents were avid music listeners, so we had these huge speakers, and my father had this whole set. There was at the bottom was a record player, and there was a CD player in there. There was a cassette player in there, and then he had there were like 4 towers basically, and the middle one had all of that, and there were 2 towers that could rotate, and there were just CDs. And he had, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of CDs at the house. And I remember I would start to scan through that, and I would hear there were certain things that he would play pretty often, but through him, like he was the one that was putting me onto tons of music my entire life growing up, more so than any of my teachers, I would say, and whenever I would see my mom start to dance when I would play along to the songs, then I knew I was doing something right, So kind of the both of them, I feel like, even though they're not musicians, my mom and my dad were kind of my biggest musical mentors, because my father was constantly hipping me to a bunch of music, and just seeing the enjoyment in my mother whenever I was playing everything correctly, it was like, okay, this is what I want to do. Like seeing what she's doing, that's what I want to make everybody who's listening to this music do as well. So.
Would like to get your input, if you don't mind sharing, about something like the current state of improv music. And by this, I mean, as the streaming services have become for a portion of the population, curators of music, and like an entrance in some cases for like what they consider to be like the current state of a specific genre or in a specific scene. It seems to me like when I go through those playlists and I listen to this music, there is a portion of artists that have like a very clear lineage to the tradition of jazz, and by this I mean, of course, the Samara Joys, like with the Walter Smith III's, the Emmett Cohen's, that is always like in those playlists. But you will also find like the artists that come from more like the cross-genre fusion to jazz that comes through like Kamasi Washington, Damian J.D. Beck, like Bad But Not Good, and all of these artists that are a little bit more hip to like the younger audiences. I will say like internationally speaking, enjoy both, of course. But like in your case, what do you envision is sort of like the where is improv music moving in the future, because, or in the present, sorry, and in the near future, because both of these music, even though it is different, they share like improvisation in the heart of their music, right? So I'm curious about where do you think, if it's this cross-genre exploration is helps keep this music relevant for like younger audiences, or if there's like a sort of cycle of return in which like artists that come from like a more traditional setting, and I mean by that, like, of course, like more of like the acoustic side of jazz music, eventually like arise again, like in like other mainstream critical acclaim popularity outside of the United States and internationally. So I'm curious about your input of what do you think is like where things are heading, hoping my question is of course clear.
Yeah, I think I understood it. And that's a loaded question. It's a really good question too. Excuse me. I think that as far as the direction of music, I think every music is eternally going to be pulling from other influences. I think that regardless of what genre of music it is, I think that there's always going to be this merging of influences from other styles of playing, other genres of music. one thing that I think, one notion that I believe is, or that I personally don't agree with, is thinking that we have to do something to appeal to younger audiences intentionally. My mindset of it, or the way I understand it is, if it's good, and somebody's gonna like it. Even when it comes to straight ahead music, I think that we have this understanding that that's something that appeals to older audiences. But then if you look at a lot of the golden age of this music, and you look at these musicians and the impact that they had, from Charlie Parker to John Coltrane to Miles Davis to all of these, whoever, Bud Powell, Earl Hines, Willie the Lion Smith, Teddy Wilson. These musicians were young when they were changing the direction of the music. Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, and their relevance lasted for so long. Like Miles Davis was relevant into the 90s. Herbie Hancock is still relevant, and you can trace stuff back to the early 60s, to 1960 with his debut record. So it's, all of these people, they're just dope. Yeah. They're just great musicians, and they put out really good music. And I think that we don't have to, or for me personally, and maybe this will change because I'm 29. I just turned 29 a few weeks ago. Maybe when I'm 49, I might be more intentional about appealing to a specific audience. And maybe that's one of the privileges that I have as a younger musician, is people don't really know who I am, so they want to see what I'm doing, hopefully. They're saying, okay, I see a little bit that this person has done. Let me take a listen into some other things that they're doing, as opposed to maybe somebody who's older, where that there might not be the same enthusiasm or excitement to hear what they're doing, But yeah, I think that there's always going to be young people who are interested in bebop, There's always going to be young people who are interested in hard bop, who are interested in cool jazz, who are interested in fusion. And I don't think that we have to say, in order to make this relevant or likable or acceptable to a younger audience, I got to put some Meek Mill in there. I got to put some Young Dolph in there. I have to put some Summer Walker in there. I have to put those are all artists I like listening to that are out now. And if you choose to do that, I think it should be something that's an honest, artistic decision. This is something that I'm genuinely hearing. So that's why I choose to input that into my music. If you really like the 40s and you really want what you're doing now to sound like that, but how it would sound in today's world, then I'm sure there's gonna, if it's really good, then there's gonna be somebody who likes it. There's gonna be somebody who likes it, even if it's bad, probably, because that's all subjective. But I think that ultimately the goal should be to make good music and to make honest music, to make honest art, even beyond just music, to make honest art, to make good art, to be true to yourself in what you're composing or performing, whatever you're doing, and to just put it out there. And of course, we have to make a living. So that's where I feel like a lot of other things kind of come into play, is why I want to be able to appeal to a bigger audience in order to make a living off of this. Because I don't want to have a day job where I'm washing dishes and doing something I don't want to do that might be taking me away from what I want to do. So that brings a lot of other things into question. But like I said before, and I really stand 10 toes down on it, I believe that any artist at any stage of their development, one of the primary focuses should always be to create art that is true to yourself and true to your story. And that you should be also considering, where do I want to go with this as well? And how can I kind of maybe set the listener up for what's to come next?
one of the things related to this question that I find very interesting as we continue to talk about the exposure of the music is seems like these two words that I was mentioning, they also sometimes inhabit different places of live music. And by this I mean, like for instance, if I go to a music festival that it is mainly built around alternative music or things like that, I might find myself listening to Domi and J.D. Beck in this setting, right? And like, but like maybe like sometimes I mean Herbie Hancock it is on the Glastonbury's or things like that. But like it has sometimes like the festivals that have jazz music like that is acoustic or a little bit more traditional will be like those that are like just broader spectrum, like a lot of music genres at the same time. So it seems like at the same time like it is sometimes being consumed in different settings. And even like the Grammys, like there's times in which like it is separate. Like I mean, not times, it is separated in the sense of when you have like best jazz performances and best jazz recordings, seem to be a little bit more true to the tradition. And please correct me if I'm wrong on that. And then you have like the best instrumental recordings in which like these other artists might find their way, right? Yeah. So do you think like this categorization, these offerings in different settings help broaden the exposure of jazz music, or do you think it actually segregates or puts like barriers into like don't mix up like this music with this music because it comes from a different place? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that it maybe it depends on what it is that you want to be. I don't know. It depends on a lot of things. One of the issues that I hear a lot of musicians talk about, at least jazz musicians in particular, and when I say jazz musicians, I'm saying musicians who are maybe playing and dealing more with the swing beat. Yeah. Because even that term can be so broad. Is Robert Glasper jazz? Is this jazz? Is what, I think that one of the issues that I personally do kind of agree with, and you hear a lot of people complain about, is you see a jazz festival and there aren't many people who are dealing with the swing groove, with the swing beat on the jazz festival. So now you say, oh, well, maybe this will bring more attention to jazz. But what it's actually doing is it's giving the listener a different definition of what that music is, or of what that word is, So then you see jazz, and then you start to associate it with something else, For me personally, I do associate jazz fairly strongly with the swing groove. I think that there can be a lot of things that are jazz influenced, but I feel that the swing beat, the ride cymbal beat, and the interpretation of the triplet and of the eighth note is something that is very specific to jazz, or Black American music, whatever it is that you want to call it. So it's tough. I think that lines end up getting blurred, and I feel like it's cool for us as, I would say, swing musicians, I'll say, to make it even more clear. I feel like swing musicians maybe feel a little bit more excitement when we see another swing musician play on another festival that's, maybe it is advertised as a jazz festival and there's not much swing at all. But then when you actually see somebody who's swinging on it, it's like, finally, a jazz festival that's honoring its roots, instead of a jazz festival and you don't really hear any of that history of the music. So that's one of my personal things. I personally would like to hear more of that and different interpretations of that within the world of that groove and of that rhythm. I would like to hear more of that at more festivals that are claiming to be jazz festivals. There are certain artists that you'll see, and it can get dicey. Like they might play, and that's the other thing. You have an artist like, I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce her name, Leve or Laufi. I know a lot of people pronounce it differently. Laufi, right? Yeah, but she has good music. But then you see that and it's, okay, this is somebody who's performing standards. is this a jazz concert? You know, should this be at a jazz festival? Should it be at a pop festival? How is the person, and I feel like it brings up a lot of other things. How is this person advertising themselves? How are they being advertised? How are they being presented? And then you get into the streaming platforms and what playlists are they on and who are their listeners, and, you know, so there's a lot of things to kind of determine what the thing is, but, you know, I'll leave it at that. I would personally like to see a little bit more representation of that groove, you know, at festivals that are saying that they're jazz festivals. Whereas I feel like what you're seeing more of is popularity beating out legitimacy. I think that that's a serious issue in the music world at this very moment. I think that popularity has successfully beaten out legitimacy for quite some time now. And so now we're seeing, and I don't want to put this on the entire generation, but you're seeing a lot of, in my generation and even the generation to come, a lot of people who are now seeking out popularity and not putting the same emphasis on legitimacy. And that kind of goes back to what I said before. If it's good, you're going to have a crowd. You know, you don't have to worry about Instagram followers and streams and all this other stuff. If you're just really damn good, like if you just play the hell out of your instrument and you do a really good job and you have a lot of vision and you have a good band and you know how to select a band, I think that's what Miles Davis did, and that's what sustained him for so long and helped him to have such a beautiful career for years. Aside from any of his personal stuff, you have somebody who has deeply studied the music, has had their own personal limitations, but has understood how to navigate those limitations and to present it in a fashion to where you end up developing an audience and you have a strong vision for what you want to do and you don't care about what anybody else is saying. I think he's the perfect example of that. Stevie Wonder is another, you know, who maybe isn't a jazz musician, but has a lot of that influence. So anyways, I'm talking long, but those are my thoughts on that.
But firstly, I want to speak to you about your rhythm section on the album, as we were talking about string and all of that. You, of course, come from a tradition in which, like, you have accompanied artists as a drummer yourself. Nevertheless, on this recording, you decided to go with a piano to create these songs, and you have your colleagues Zach and Boris, who I think do a fantastic job on the rhythm section of the recording. But tell me a little bit about the decision to sort of like go into the piano for this recording, and how do you think having both those guys accompanying you in the project uplift the music and create it into what it is in the recording?
Absolutely, that's a really good question too. So I'll start with Zach. Zach is one of my best friends. Zach is a beautiful human being and a beautiful, fantastic drummer. And I just want to lead with that. That's somebody who I have a lot of love and a lot of respect for, and I've learned a lot from him. Zach is somebody who has been with me early on in my compositional process, my compositional journey, which we're forever on. But Zach is somebody who has seen me early on, like my first few compositions. He was there with me as I was figuring those things out. He's somebody that helped actualize all of those ideas that I had in my mind. He was one of the people who kind of helped create a bit of my sound as a composer, I would say. And so, and he's also somebody who is a very, very hard worker and puts in a lot of work and effort on his own time, you know? And so there's been times where I'll be working on things and he'll come back with other ideas of how to approach playing it on the drums, you know? And so when it came to choosing people for the album, I was speaking with the people over at Posi-Tone who were so gracious to allow me to record with them for this record. And we were planning to have an older rhythm section. So we were gonna say, okay, we wanna pair you with some musicians who've been out here for quite some time, and they can support you well. They know how to support, how to accompany, how to build you and lift you up. And I was all for it. And so the funny thing was there was actually a miscommunication with the initial drummer on the album who was gonna play. The funny thing was the day before I had a rehearsal with Zach and another good friend of mine, Marty Jaffe, fantastic bassist in the city. And we just went through a bunch of the music, and I was just trying to make sure the charts were okay, and that, you know, I wanted to basically get a rehearsal in on my own with the songs. And it's funny because Zach sounded so good, and in my head I was like, man, it would be great to just have Zach on this. You know, he already knows most of my music. I don't even know if he might have been off book for almost the entire record date. Like, I don't know if he had music for, I would say at most he had music for like 3 charts, you know, at most. But he knew the music, you know, so it was no problem. And that makes it so much easier for me. And at that point, it kind of helped with Boris, because Boris is an incredible, incredible bass player. But when you have somebody who's new to the group, if you have 2 other guys who already know the music, you kind of just fit right in. Instead of having one person who knows everything and 2 people who don't, now the people who know everything is the majority. So it's easier to just get in where you fit in, because now, you know, oh man, I just kind of have to listen, you know, even if the chart might be wrong in a couple points, they're on the same page. So and it's obvious. So that was really helpful. And that was my first time playing with Boris, and he sounds amazing. He's been on a bunch of recordings that I've listened to before as well, whether it's Posi-Tone recordings or other recordings. He's been playing with the Mingus Orchestra for some time now too. So I had been seeing him around quite a bit, and it was kind of a no-brainer. You know, and Posi-Tone also kind of has like you see a lot of names pop up pretty often on a lot of their records, and they kind of have their own sound with that they've developed too. So Boris is a part of that. And so it was beautiful to have him on the project as well. And he has just such a beautiful, big sound that was very supportive and helped a lot to uplift everybody on the album.
I also want to bring up, if you don't mind, talking just a little bit more about Stevie Wonder, as you're, of course, covering one of his songs. And I have a special connection to his music because it was one of the first artists that, for myself, coming from a non-jazz background, I had the chance to explore like different types of harmonies. Like it was something that really stood out to me and like helped me venture into this music eventually. And I think here in Mexico specifically, but I would even better to say in Latin America, even though he is a name that rings a bell out of everybody, he is well known and still like acclaimed. It doesn't seem to me like his popularity has carried away as much as other artists, because like thinking about the time period and just the different things that go into making an artist, popular, with the power of television coming into Mexico, concerts, live videos, all of that. I think like he has been a little bit not forgotten. I think like we can make a service into just talking about himself and his influence, and like just how relevant he continues to be. Like he will be even an artist that I will say blindfolded from like English speaking music. He is one of the few artists that I can really say like I can see him in 40, 50 years still be relevant, still being played, still being talked about. So just tell us a little bit about your connection to the music of Stevie Wonder and your decision to cover Knock Me Off My Feet on this recording, please.
Sure, yeah. So that was actually something through the inspiration of Mark Free, who's one of the owners of Posi-Tone Records, and he was talking to me. He said, "Man, we'd love for you to record a piece of something that maybe you don't hear in a certain context, but it's something that you've listened to a lot. Whether you want to make it swing or make it, personalize it in any way that you would like to." And for me, one of the artists I grew up listening to a lot was Stevie Wonder, and he has such a unique sound harmonically, on the keyboard, on synth bass, on harmonica, on vocals. He has such a distinct voice in so many different, on the drums even, because he plays drums on a lot of his albums. Stevie is somebody he's really a genius, He explores so many sounds and textures and keys in all of his pieces. And it's something that still inspires me and challenges me and holds me accountable to this day. When I hear what he's doing, it challenges me to write something to the best of my ability. It's probably gonna pale in comparison to Stevie, but that's like a goal to work towards. It's like one of his songs, and so that's somebody I've always loved and admired. And I had the chance to see him live when I was in Tennessee. I was studying at University of Tennessee for my undergrad, and he came through Thompson Bowling Arena. So yeah, I just wanted to record something, and something like that is such a masterpiece. I didn't want to change it too much, so I said, well, what if we do it like maybe a light samba, and maybe change a couple of the chords, not much, but just the slightest changes to it. So that was really it. I wanted to not mess with it too much, but personalize it just enough. So, and actually, funny enough, now I have a different arrangement. It's nothing like, it's not that different, but we might even play it here. We'll see.
And I know that we're almost on time, but I do want to have the chance just to ask you one more question. And it is about the fact that you're, of course, outside of your recordings and outside of your live playing, you're also participating on the soundtrack of a movie developed by Maggie Gyllenhaal, which we're all very fans of. But I'm just curious, like, if there's anything that you can share about your involvement in the project as a whole, and like, from the music perspective, like what are you supporting like within the project, and just whatever, of course, you feel comfortable sharing about the project.
Absolutely. So I was contacted by one of the music producers, I guess it was, of the movie, and it's The Bride of Frankenstein, directed by Maggie Gyllenhaal, and I think it's set to come out maybe October of next year, I want to say. We shot, and funny enough, Brandon Woody actually was in a couple of the scenes too. And so it's funny because I had just recorded the music in the studio one of the days, and then somebody said, "Would you happen to know Brandon Woody by any chance?" I was like, "Oh, we're playing in like a week, So I sent her his contact, and he ended up being on a couple other scenes himself. But anyways, that was something where one of the producers reached out to me, and they just were looking for a bunch of musicians in New York City to be just musicians in the movie. We weren't gonna have any lines or anything, but just to be in it, which was a cool opportunity. So I was like, yeah, I'd love to be in a movie. And we got closer to the shoot date, which was I'm guessing it's one of the earlier scenes in the movie, because it was one of their first days of shooting. And I remember a few days before, they reached out and they said, hey, we need some songs recorded. Somebody else had recorded the music, and they just weren't really pleased with how it came out. Studio, and somebody had written some pieces, and and it was a period piece, so it was kind of in the 20s. So dealing with like more stride piano and that sound, or I think maybe more of the 30s was that period, that time of the movie. And so it was beautiful just being able to play a character in the movie and to also have a small part in the music as well.